Okay, so the second example I want to talk about is this map done in 1858 by Florence Nightingale, right? You know her, you know, she is the lady with the lamp, the nurse, you know, who kind of modernized and improved the profession of nursing quite a bit, right? So she also did some interesting data visualization, right? That's something that we all, many people do not know. Okay, so what she did here, again, which fundamentally changed how the profession of medicine was practiced, was this, right? So there was a war and Crimean War, I think, and one of the insights that she had in treating wounded soldiers, you know, from the war was that a lot of these soldiers were coming in with minor battlefield injuries and getting very sick in the hospital, okay, and then eventually dying as well, okay. And then she knew that these soldiers need not have died at all, you know, just because they came to the hospital they died, okay. What was happening there in the hospitals? Why do you think this soldiers with minor injuries are coming to the hospitals and dying? Mostly infections, cross infections that was happening, right? Because hospital is a place where there are a lot of very sick people there, and just being in that location itself is very dangerous, right? More dangerous than actually battlefield, okay. So this is the story that she wanted to say, and then, you know, there was not many people who were willing to listen to her, right? So the conventional wisdom at that point of time is that no matter how lightly or grievously injured you are, you just get sent to the hospital where you recover, and then you get sent home or back to the battlefield, whichever is the case, right? Nobody thought or questioned this whole idea, right? I mean, what is wrong with this idea, right? Because it seems like a logical thing to do, right? You get injured in the battle, go to the hospital, get treated. If it is very severe, then you take rest. You know, if it is so bad that, you know, you lost a limb or something like that, you can't fight anymore, go home, otherwise come back to the battle, right? Seems like a perfectly understood thing, but then she was trying to say that the conditions in the hospital need to improve. We need to invest more resources in separating the patients, giving them enough room, improving the living conditions, the treatment conditions of patients, how close you can put the beds together, how certain type of patients need to be separated from other types of patients, how the hospital staff need to practice hygiene, meaning that they need to have more scrubs, more kinds of gloves, and, you know, more antiseptic and disinfectant and, you know, cleaning products or whatever, right? She was fighting for all of them because she is in charge of the nurses, right? And it is her job to make sure the nurses can do a good job of it, and she was fighting a losing battle here because despite all their hard work, still a lot of people are just dying, okay. So what she did was she kept a meticulous record of the soldiers who coming in, and then she also categorized them based on what kind of illness they were suffering from, okay. Was it light injuries, grievous injuries, or some kind of a communicable disease, right? Some of these soldiers actually got sent to very bad places and they were contracted other kinds of diseases also, right? So not necessarily battlefield injuries, okay. So these three colors essentially tell them about it. So this kind of beige pink ones are okay. So the areas blue, red and black wedges are each measured from the blue wedges measured from the center of the circle represent the area preventable or mitigable diseases. The red are from wounds and the black wedges are from all the other causes. The deaths from all the other causes during the entire area may be compared. So a very large portion of them were actually preventable, easily treatable ones, right? And these are deaths, okay, these are people who died actually, right? So these were other causes, these were from battlefield injuries, and these were easy minor injuries that are preventable and so on, right? Or they contracted something that was preventable, right? So they came for a minor injury, but then they contracted cholera while they were here, or something else, right? Something more severe, okay? And then they became very severely sick and then died, okay? So she presented this and then showed that how a large portion of why they were dying could have been prevented. So these people could have actually been saved, okay? Unnecessarily they died, okay? And then when people saw this presented in this form, okay, so this is a kind of a chart that she invented, okay? So she called it a rose diagram. Now it's popularly called as spider chart. Also it is called as something else, I forget the name of it. Okay, and usually it is very good for cyclical data, like yearly cycle of 12 months, because you can nicely segment it in 12 parts and so on. Okay, so and then she did this, and then when she presented this, people could see that a lot of people were dying unnecessarily, and then they agreed to increase the funding that was required, and then they also agreed to some of the reforms that she was proposing, right? Like separate these patients, separate the communicable disease patients from the rest of it, and then when you're treating patients from one part of the hospital to other part of the, take precautionary measures, change your scrubs, change your gloves, and etc., right? All those things, I mean, we're really not there at all, I mean, it was very common for doctors to be operating on one patient and directly moving to other patient, because they did not understand well enough that that they could be transmitting something potentially harmful from one patient to another patient, right? So all these things got relooked, and then the processes were reviewed, and then after that the changes improved and these things started to reduce. But there is a interesting trick that she did here, which actually misrepresents the data. Can you tell me what it is? Misrepresent the data that helps her story. So what she is encoding here is the length, right? So you are supposed to compare this length versus this length versus this length, right? But what you end up comparing is this area versus this area versus this area, right? So it leads people to comparing areas while they were supposed to compare lengths, right? The data is the length, so it's very clear, right? The areas each measured from the center as a common vertex, right? So the vertex is the length, right? So the data is encoded as lengths, but it gives an impression that it is encoded as an area, right? So it's very hard to separate a length when it is represented as an area, okay? And therefore this appears, and the farther away from the center, the areas are going to likely to get larger, right? So if she had actually reversed it, okay, that she had put blue first, okay, then black next, and then pink, then the pink also would have looked big enough, okay? It wouldn't have looked as dramatic as this. In fact, you can take this data and then replot it with the different color coding. You will see that the blue and the pink would be almost the same size, okay? Now the blue looks dramatically bigger than the pink one, okay? Which is the point that she wanted to communicate. She wanted people to just wake up, get alarmed by this diagram and then do something about it. So people give her that, okay, I mean, she was doing it for a good cause, even though she was doing something, slightly sly, okay? But eventually, it helped her make her case better. But when you need to recognize that it's a flawed encoding here, okay? And this is something that you have to be very careful.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm not sure if the answer is available somewhere, but I was just looking at November, and then the pink part has appeared twice in that. That is
Right.
where pink.
I don't know. There must be something about this data which differentiate one pink from the other pink.
So there's a line, the black line across the red triangle. November marks the boundary of deaths from all other causing during the month.
So currently, rather than making a black wedge, she just put a line there.
Yeah. That's line.
Oh, okay. But then if there's a black wedge, then she could have put it here, right? Why is there? It is.
I think for a And then for November it doesn't.
Probably she just forgot to cut it. So it's totally source constraint. So she had to like. No, so that's why she had to.
Okay, so I mean there must be some reason here. Is there like from two different wars or something that they were coming? No, right?
No, it's just written Crimea.
And the Bulgaria is also there.
So I don't know. We can, you know, if you guys can dig into a little bit further and then find out. So something is happening. So this is 1956, right? And this is.
So it's written here, the black line across the red triangle,
Huh.
November 1854 marks the boundary of the states from all other.
Oh, okay, so here is the answer, I think, right? So it says the black line across the red triangle in November 1854 marks the boundary of the deaths from all other causes during the month.
She just didn't fill in the black part. So that black line continues across all the black wedges.
It's just a representational error, so she added it to the index.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so this is the more famous one. You might have come across this. Also considered to be one of the very important works in this field. There won't be any introductory class in data visualization without this example being cited. If you're familiar with it, I won't go through it in a lot more detail. But is everybody familiar with this diagram? Right? Yeah. Okay. So interesting thing is that how multiple dimensions are very economically. Remember the word, So the great thing about Minard's map is the economy with which it conveys so much of information with so little. Okay. So there are 6 dimensions of data here, right? So there is size of the army, direction of the army, the geographical locations, the time, and then the temperatures. And then there's something else. So all of that is all encoded in this very single thing, and what appears to be a very dry display, tells a very poignant story of what happened. As it is told, there's an army that starts out, which is 400,000 strong, returns back without waging a single day in battle as a 10,000 strong army. 390,000 people, soldiers lost just like that, okay, for a really bad thing. And many factors contributed to this. It was at the fag end of a very long campaign of wars, almost 10 years of war, non-stop. This army has been fighting. Very bad weather conditions during this very ill-fated and ill-considered campaign, because the weather that year was particularly worse, too much of rain, very cold, record cold temperatures, and generally poor passageways, which the Napoleon's army totally underestimated, right? So it was a modern army that was designed to carry supplies in convoys of vehicles, right? But the geography and the terrain did not allow that to happen, right? Because the roads were not good enough, the vehicles got stuck. Army marched forward, supplies got stuck, army and the supplies got separated, army starved, and then many of the people died just out of starvation because they did not have enough to eat. And and then everything kind of coming through such a dramatic manner, right? So here is a very powerful story that is told through a very simple graphical display of data. Okay, a good example of that.
This map was much before the cholera map.
Yeah. So this is this is the 1812 campaign, but it was done in 1869. The display itself was done in 69, right? Minard was an engineer, right? And he did many of such things, right? He did for other wars as well, right? So this is the more famous example of his work, but there are also other work. So this flow diagram is something that he kind of invented and popularized. So, this is called a flow diagram, right. Data flows are depicted visually. So, this is the war, and this is when it was created.
So what is the black section? The black.
This one. So, this is the retreating army. So, this is the army that started out somewhere in France, right, and then it marches forward all the way to Moscow, and then as you see the size becomes smaller, and then at some point of time they decide not to proceed further or fight at all. They camp outside Moscow, lay siege to the city, but then never go inside, and then they retreat, and they took a different pathway because their onward journey was really fraught with a lot of losses. They thought that they will take a better alternative route, but then the returning route was also equally bad, and therefore you could see that the army sizes dropping dramatically. So, you see that dropping happening whenever they cross a river, right. Again, these were rivers without bridges. So, you have to just wade through waters or have some temporary ways by which you can cross, and so a lot of people just got washed away in the water or just froze to death in the water, and then it becomes thinner, and then so this is the size. This is 400,000. This is 10,000. So, the size is encoded, the army in that thing. The color is the forward army and the retreating army, and this is the temperature. So, record low temperatures. I have a very high resolution image of this. Now, I will bring it in the next class and show it to you. You will be able to see all the labels better clearly. Okay, so this is a very interesting story as well. Okay, again done by somebody who's not a designer, not meant to do data visualization, anything like this. So, we have seen a doctor, we have seen a nurse, we have seen an engineer, and this guy is a draftsman. Okay, he's an electrical draftsman working for London Underground. Okay, Henry Beck was his name. He was a draftsman working in the electrical department of the London Underground, the metro, as we might call it. So, in 1931, the London Underground was already a very busy and a complex system, right? And this is the map that existed at that time, and as you can see, there are multiple lines which are encoded in different colors, and the stations are marked and the intersections are marked, right? Intersections are where you change from one line to another line, right? And it also shows the river Thames, and the important point is that it is geographically integral. Okay, so the geographical locations, so it's a geographically accurate map. Okay, the positions of the stations are geographically accurate. Okay, and the underground company had plans of further adding more lines, right, to a point that now this map either had to become very big or they had to do something about it. Okay, and this was the dilemma that they had. They didn't know what to do. Okay, except that they thought that maybe we have to make a bigger map, right, in order to accommodate more lines and more stations. Otherwise, it was too crowded. Already you can see that people were making mistakes about which is which, and they had to have these lines and arrows connecting labels and locations. Okay, so you see this Warren Street is here, and they had to put an arrow to show that this is Warren Street. Okay, this is Good Street, Tottenham Court, and so on, right. So, nobody asked Henry Beck. He was just sitting in his spare time. He took this map, and then because of his familiarity with drawing a lot of these electrical circuits and so on, he abstracted this map and came up with a radically new version of the map. Okay, and this is the map that he came up with, right. You can see what he has done, right. Can you tell me what he has done? There are only three types of lines he is using: horizontal, vertical, and 45 degrees, right. So, from what used to be this multiple like winding streets, winding lines, now it's just become three type of lines, right. So, what is done is dramatically reduced visual complexity. Okay. Now, that's very important for any kind of comprehension of visual information, right? The more cluttered, complex the visual, the more harder it is for you to understand that, right? So, one of the jobs as visualization designers that you will have to do is figure out how to reduce complexity without reducing the complexity of the information, right? So, how can you achieve more throughput of information with less complex visuals, right? So, the previous one and this one has the same information, right, but this is a lot more accessible because the visual complexity is lesser, okay, the clutter is reduced. So, what that means is that you have multiple angles, the eyes are constantly trying to resolve these lines, right. So, with less lines, less type of lines, then your eyes become easier, less lines to resolve, okay. And because he is not worried so much about geographical accuracy, he is also not worried about the geographical distance between the stations, right. So, that is the important innovation that he did, right. So, what he did was he took the first station and the last station, calculated the amount of length that he has for that line, equally divided that line into the number of stations that were presented on the line. Okay. So, you see that these are equally placed lines, okay, but the stations are not equally distanced, right. Some stations are close by, some stations are far away, right, but he did not care so much, right. So, that also reduces visual complexity because you are kind of when to you are able to anticipate visually, right. So, which is also why justified text is easier to, why we justify text at all. Okay. Suppose if it is not left justified, what will happen? Your text is not left justified in a paragraph. If it starts at different places, what will happen? Yeah, correct, right. Every time your eyes has to acquire the beginning of the line, okay, and various places it is there, it is going to take much longer time to do it. So, what happens in a justified text is that after 2 lines, right, your eyes will automatically be calibrated to pick the starting of the next line, okay. So, it makes it that much, it's a fraction of a second, but a very critical fraction of a second, okay. Similarly, right also, right, if it is right justified, you kind of know where it ends, right, if it ends in but right justified is not so useful as a left justified. So, centrally aligned text is very hard to read because they all end at different places and then they start at different places, right. So, there is a predictability to where they are placed, right, and that is very important, okay, when you are seeking information, visually seeking information. Yeah.
So while dividing the stations equally, so then you are also taking away one layer of information altogether, that is the distance.
Right. So why is he? So he has to so he is discarding geographical accuracy. He is also discarding the distances, right? Now he has to have a reason for doing that, right? So he is now saying that given that I get so much better clarity, legibility in my visual, I am okay to do that, right. So it seems like a okay thing, and especially because it is an underground network. Okay, so underground network is basically you go and then you don't see anything outside. Okay, it doesn't matter, you are traveling between all in between. I mean, all your travel is the same. You are not looking outside, and there is like the scenery keeps changing, right? That's what happens in a bus, right? So you know that you are going from Vikhroli to Ghatkopar versus Ghatkopar to Kurla, for example, right? Because you are traveling above the ground, right? When you are traveling underground, it doesn't matter, right, where you are, and the distances don't matter at all. Okay, which is also, and geographically being accurate is also not so important, right?
But sir, like could you you could tell the time it would take you to reach from one station to another? It could help.
Yeah. So the distances might help. Okay, again distances was a vestige of the previous maps, right? So how did this previous map come about? It all came about from the road maps that we had, right? The road maps used to be geographically accurate. It would show the roads. It will show exactly the distances between 2 points and so on and so forth, right? So when they did when the underground railway network map, they just continued to follow the same thing, did not rethink, does this require a different kind of a representation, right? Different kind of a display, right? So that's what is precisely what Henry Beck was doing. So distances was not important, but maybe time was more important, right? So now here is it completely changed the unit of measurement, right? Instead of thinking of two stations as separated by 10 miles or 15 miles, you are now thinking about 10 minutes or 15 minutes, okay? That's a more useful measurement as a commuter to you rather than the distance itself, right? So the distance now converted in timing. So people are not thinking about 2 stations away means that they know roughly it will be like 10 minutes, if it is 5 stations it will be 40 minutes or whatever it is, right? So and this stations are placed more or less based on the time rather than the distance. And he also encoded the normal stations versus the interchanges, right? So interchanges were these diamonds, normal stations were these lines. And one geographical feature that he retained despite everything he decided to chuck out is the river Thames, right? So even that he kind of abstracted it. You could notice that he is also using the same horizontal vertical 45 degrees. In fact, when there is no vertical, there is a bit of vertical here. Otherwise it's 45 degrees and horizontal lines, right? Why do you think he retained the river? Any geographical feature in any city, right? Especially if it happens to be a kind of a very major geographical landmark like the river or a mountain, or sometimes it could be a man-made landmark also. People will orient themselves mentally according to the landmark, okay? So these landmarks, right, physical landmarks have a very strong place in how people orient themselves. People imagine themselves as being on this side of the river or that side of the river, right? If they have to go, they will say I have to cross the river and go to that side of the river, right? So the river still plays a very important role in people's conception of the city, okay, and therefore it is important to keep that, okay. So that part of the map is still accurate. So for example, if the river crosses between these 2 stations, he left it at that stage. So it's precisely between these 2 stations is where the river is crossing. So people know that when they go from East Putney to Putney something, Putney Bridge, right, they know that they are crossing the river, okay, and that's where they are crossing the river, okay. So there is a very interesting book on called Mental Cities, which talks about the imageability of the city, how legible a city is. We talk about legibility of text, of posters, of displays and all, right. There is also something called a legibility of a city itself, okay. Some cities are inherently legible, meaning that you can get a very good grasp of how the city is oriented, and some cities are very illegible. Even if you live there for a very long time, you just cannot get a hang around it. A good example is Bangalore, right? It's very hard to get a head around like where you are, where you're going, which is east, which is south, and the ring roads are not ring roads, at all, because they are not complete rings, right? They are only like quarter rings or half rings, or they are not even in the form of a circle, right? And so on. But some of the cities, usually cities which has some natural landmark like a river or a very strong coastal line or a mountain become easy to legible. Bombay has a very strong legibility because of this very strong north-south orientation that we have. It's a small island, it can't expand any further. We have these 2 major railway networks, the Western Line and the Central Line, and there are these 2 major arterial roadways, Eastern Expressway, Western Expressway, and many of the stations are either east or west, right? You have the Kanjurmarg East, Kanjurmarg West, and so on and so forth, right? So it's kind of easy to understand and as well as predict, like what is, even the areas that you are not aware of, you can kind of guess from what you know already, okay? So that's called the legibility of the city. So when city and town planners design cities, right, they should consider this legibility also, because it also is a quality or attribute you want in your city, right? So that is the reason why he retained the river. So there was like lots of very interesting things happened. Again, it was met with huge shock when it was presented to people. The people who made these decisions about what kind of maps they have to print, right? And they said, what is this? It's completely unlike anybody has ever seen before, right? Nobody has seen a map like this. And they were very skeptical that people will accept this kind of a map, okay? But then they were also willing to try it out on a small trial basis of 1,000 copies, that they would print it and distribute to commuters and then see how they respond to it. And it was a runaway hit, when it was tried out. The people just lapped it up, and they completely bought into this whole idea. And this was the first abstract map of any kind of a transportation network that was ever created, and became a blueprint for everything that followed. Okay. Now there are hundreds of networks around the world which follow the same design principles that Henry Beck did first. What it also did, it had some very interesting unintended but very beneficial consequences. One was that around this time the city was getting very crowded, and it was very difficult for the authorities to convince the city people to move to the suburbs. Okay, so they were saying that no, actually you can live in the suburbs. Rather than living in this small apartment in the city, why don't you move to a bigger house in the suburbs? Okay, which is only 30 miles away, and then nobody was taking that up, right? Even though a lot of suburbs were developed, nobody was moving there, okay, because they did not want to give up living in the city, right? Because it was just too important for them. But when this map came out, now the people's conception of what the city itself changed, okay? Rather than thinking of Watford being somewhere far out in the village, right? Now people thought of it as it's 10 stations away, right? From wherever they were living, right? From Queen's Park or whatever, right? Or Marylebone, Edgware Road, which is the center of the city. So they said, okay, it doesn't seem so bad, it's just 10 stations away. So this map was actually indirectly helpful in convincing people to move people outside. Okay, so after this map became widely used, and then people's conception of how the city is organized, people were more willing to take up houses in the suburb. A lot of people moved out, and then and the network further expanded, and it's even more complicated now. Okay, so again, very radical example, redesign example that completely changed many things about how we display information.